Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Francisco Morales Wash Process Guatemala from Calendar Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Calendar, based out of Galway, Ireland. And they're easily our most featured Irish coffee roaster on this channel, though we haven't featured them as much recently, and that's because the multi-roaster that we usually pick them up from hasn't carried a lot of their coffees this year. However, I have heard a lot about this coffee from Zach, who states that it's one of his favorite coffees of the entire year. So when I did see this at that multi-roaster, it felt like a great opportunity to revisit Calendar and try this coffee for myself. So we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And this one I liked a little bit more through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So with Calendar, for anybody that's had their coffees in the past, they're definitely significantly lighter than a lot of their Irish contemporaries. They're actually one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters in either Ireland or England that I've ever experienced. But with that being said, they roast on a very light side of things in a kind of interesting way, as it seems so delicate. It's like a very delicate sort of light, as opposed to a light that seems to accentuate a lot of acidity. So that's to say that they are on the light side of things, but I wouldn't necessarily say like an extremely light. It's just a different sort of light, if that gives you a good idea of the roast profile of this one. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 24, first impression, and we opted for the V60 on this day, and it immediately skewed heavily in the direction of honey and a nutty attribute. And it was one of the most vibrant Calendar coffees in that sense, but it did limit some of the other factors of the cup, so it wasn't necessarily the most ideal start. Let me say this about those two things. Honey has been a little bit of overkill when it comes to coffee for me this year, as there have been so many coffees that have been extremely honey forward. And I'll be a little honest, I've been slightly burnt out by very honey forward coffees. In addition to that, I've never necessarily been the biggest fan of nutty attributes in coffees, so these two things weren't necessarily ideal. And given that my previous experiences with Calendar coffees have been that they're very kind of tame, at least from the first impression, having this one be a lot more vibrant in those two specific directions wasn't overly ideal, as those were pretty much the only two things I was getting from this cup on the first try. But we'll see if we could change that as we return to it on day 26 with the Chemex, and this was slightly more balanced, as it still offered so many of those honey and nutty attributes, but it offered a little bit more of the classic Calendar components, including that soft chocolate base with plenty of the illicit apple brightness, as well as a slight caramel component to it. So I'm like, okay, there's much more to this coffee. This is one of the reasons I preferred this brew method. There'll be more in the future. We continue on to day 28. Opted for the April brewer, and it's pretty similar to the first day, as it's exceptionally strong and well defined in the honey sense. Once again, there is the complementary nuttiness to it as well. The brightness is also notable with a lot of the classic Central American characteristics. That's soft chocolate, that caramel aspect, and then the nuttiness, which I've already kind of mentioned. So a lot of what you might expect from this coffee. We continue on to day 30. Up to temperatures, a bit more fine of a grind, opted for the V60, and there was a fair bit of improvement, as it seems to offer less of the super strong honey and nutty components to it, in place of a much more balanced cup with a candied version of the same attributes. Other components found include that soft chocolate, that caramelized sweetness, a subtle florality, and an overall much better day. So these adjustments have yielded a much more balanced and much more positive cup for me. Day 32, same adjustments to the Chemex, and this is the most dialed back it's been, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon to go with for a coffee, because usually I'm trying to get the most vibrancy and sweetness from it. But having this work in its favor seemed to help, as I was really trying to tone down the very strong honeyness within this coffee. And you can be like, you saw what this coffee was, it lists honey, it's right on the photo right there, but I'll be completely honest, I didn't expect it to be as strong as it was within this coffee. So kind of toning it down really seemed to help. It is a little bit also skewing in the fruit bright direction, being toned down with a long-lasting dark floral honey component being the most prominent thing in the finish. So I can't really escape it. It's going to be present regardless of what I do, but it's something that I just kind of had to figure out a way to maximize the other aspects within the coffee while maybe trying to keep that as toned down as possible. Day 34 kept things at the higher temperatures, and it continues to remain slightly more toned down, though it is skewing more in the heavy direction of the honey yet again. It's a pretty straightforward cup of coffee. Honey really dominates it. Soft chocolate, apple brightness, a slight caramel aspect to it. So nothing really too much to add on day 34. Day 37, another try through the Chemex with the higher temperatures, a more fine grind once again, and it's coming out classically calendar with a soft chocolate and floral base to it. So I oftentimes say those are the two things I really expect going into almost all of the calendar coffees I've had from them in the past, which is weird because I think I mentioned in our tier list of their coffee that I've mostly had Ecuadorian coffees, and I want to say, was it also Guatemalan coffees, which is kind of weird when you think about it, but those two origins have really seemed to accentuate those qualities about Calendar's coffees. And there's that slight sugar cookie sweetness, which is something I've also previously mentioned with their other coffees, a light honey focus, and some slight apple acidity. So very straightforward. Day 40, final notes, we have one more try through the V60 with increased temperatures, and the overly heavy honey feels a little bit more muted once again as it continues to give the coffee better balance. There's a very kind of tame feel right from the start. That's some other things I've said about Calendar's coffees. Entirety just feels very soft, with a floral honey being the most defining factor of it. Also a floral chocolate and just a slight bit of generic florality as well. And the chocolate also remaining very soft. Citric quality is also slightly present with the apple brightness in moderation, but also a very soft orange. First time I've experienced this, so there is some things kind of buried underneath the very straightforward and strong honey attribute of this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have two level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, as you would expect, it's a very clean cup of coffee. And here's the thing about Calendar's coffees. I've mentioned this a lot of times. They have a kind of high ceiling. So their coffees are always going to be that minimum level 4 in terms of the cleanliness. I've never had any, I think, that justifies level 5. I've had some really nice coffees from them in the past, so I don't want to undersell that part. But for the most part, I think that's kind of one of those things where you can bookmark that level 4. I still really want to try their natural processed Ethiopian coffee, and maybe their Kenyan coffee is a little different, but or was it a honey processed Ethiopian coffee? I want to try one of their non-washed coffees because I know they had a non-washed coffee last year, but I want to try it and I want to see where it marked in terms of the cleanliness. But at least for this one, definitely the level 4 mark. Other thing is the florality level 4, but that was experienced in a number of directions. As mentioned, the kind of chocolate-like florality, the honeyed florality, which was by far the most dominant and defining aspect of this coffee, and then just a generic florality as well. So that right there is scoring the level 4. That is to also kind of highlight and focus on that honey attribute of this one. And then we have a lot of level 3s. So the finish level 3, yes, it was a little bit more quicker than expected finish, which could have been on my end, and I kept going a little bit more fine on the grind to maybe get a little bit more out of this coffee, but at the same time, it finished at that level 3 mark. Sweetness level 3. I don't think that this was ever meant to be an overly sweet cup of coffee, as I feel like most of their coffees aren't necessarily meant to be overly sweet. I feel like they're meant to be a little bit more balanced, subtle, soft. In a sense, kind of reminded me of Kopi's coffees, which also offer that same sort of attribute. Like, they're rarely overly vibrant coffees. They're a little bit more of this kind of safe, as I say, low floor coffee or high floor coffees. Acidity level 3, yes, it wasn't overly bright, and that's what I was kind of alluding to when discussing the roast profile of their coffees. They come off very soft, they're very lightly roasted. You can tell that it's not necessarily overly developed, but at the same time, it doesn't really seem to offer a lot of brightness to it, so it's just a little different from some of the other lighter profiled coffees. Citrus level 3, yes, and I mentioned that there was a very soft orange, and given that this tasting wheel doesn't really skew heavily in a lot of directions, what flavor profile you are experiencing from this coffee, then they will probably score a little higher. That also does accentuate the apple brightness that's present within this one. So those things, level 3. Chocolate level 3, yes, that's the other thing that I've been mentioning quite a bit throughout this one. Once I was able to get past those first couple of impressions with the very strong heavy, I was able to experience some of the other things that this coffee had to offer. And this is a Central American coffee. You can expect a lot of the traditional Central American attributes, including the chocolate-like base. Then body level 3, yes, even with all that being said, it still has at least a fair bit of texture to it, so a little bit more on that medium bodied side of things. But outside of that, those are the only level 3s and level 4s. This tasting wheel is kind of a little bit more shrunken than normal, but I do think that kind of highlights and emphasizes the experience I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like it got off to a bad start, which was a little unfortunate for me because that very strong honey aspect was a little off-putting when it came to this coffee. Once I was able to get past that, and once I was able to work with this coffee, I did feel like it improved with some adjustments, but for the most part, I think it's kind of just safe to say that this one wasn't really suited for me. It's maybe a victim of having too many coffees in my own catalog that had that very strong honey attribute in the past. So I don't necessarily think it's a knock on this coffee in any regard. I feel like somebody that may not experience this from too many coffees would really enjoy this, but somebody like myself, I just don't think I was overly interested in continuing to experience what this coffee was most meant to be. So that's on me. We'll just put this one on me. I don't think that there was anything negative about this coffee. It just offered a flavor profile that wasn't suited for what I was hoping for in the moment. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. 2 things. First thing we must start with is the profile of this one. As I mentioned, very soft, very light, very delicate, tame coffee. Even when it does skew very strong in that honey sense, the rest of the cup is it's a little bit more tame. It's a very moderate cup of coffee. As you can see, it's not offering a lot of brightness. It's not offering a lot of sweetness to it. And it doesn't offer too many fruit components either. So it just keeps the entirety of the base of this one tame, which works for a lot of people. That's actually one of my favorite things about Calendar's coffees to begin with. But outside of that, the next thing is, of course, going to be that honey, which I continue to emphasize. If you really like that, then I think this will be a very nice fit for you in that regard because it offers in a very well-defined and pronounced abundance to it. It's very clearly experienced through this coffee right from the onset. And if that's something that you really enjoy from your coffee, especially those 2 things put together, then I feel like this one might be a really good fit for you. But I feel like it's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Francisco Morales Wash Processed Guatemala from Calendar Coffee. Thank you for watching.